brings love to the children. Yeah. In their eyes are the answers we see.
Now, here's today's host, Dr. Monika Buerger.
And their hearts lead the way.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our February Look to the Children show, courtesy of the amazing ChiroSecure. I'm your host, Dr. Monika Buerger, and I'm presenting to you live from Paris. Actually, Paris Hotel, that is, in Las Vegas. So I am going to share with you today a few pearls that I think are really important for you to understand the magnitude of what we're dealing with in today's world in regards to these little kiddos, and the power of chiropractic. So thank you for joining me, and let's rock and roll. I don't have anybody talking back with me this time, so got to adapt here a little bit. So let's talk about genes. Not the genes you wear, our DNA. So genes are an expression, and they're an expression of life. Genes are regulated by our epigenes, and that's been out, the last decade and a half. We've been talking about epigenes or epigenomics. So the epigene is what sets on top of the gene, and essentially what is controlling our gene expression. And our epigenes are triggered or influenced by our life stressors. So that is our external environment, those toxins and stressors coming from the outside world, and our internal environment as well, what we call endotoxins. So hopefully you can see my PowerPoint here. Our epigenes are influenced by traumas, toxins, thoughts, and technology. So let's break those down a little bit. One thing that I have found is we really have to define stress for our patients. We throw that word around very easily, and a lot of our patients look at stress from the viewpoint as far as, I'm stressed out because I have a test tomorrow. I'm stressed out because I got in an argument with my husband. I'm stressed out because of work, etc. They're looking at stress from that aspect. For us as chiropractors, we're looking at stress from a global standpoint. So we learn, most of us do in our school, about traumas, toxins, thoughts. And I throw in technology these days because technology is changing the way the brain is developing. So furthermore, we should break down trauma for our patients. We have physical trauma, which is micro trauma or macro trauma. And for our little parts, that includes micro traumas in utero and certainly with the birthing process. And then there's emotional trauma. We know now that our genes, our DNA is influenced by the pull down of generations before us and their emotional status. There's a very popular study, we call it the cherry blossom study. And what they did was they exposed male rats to the smell of cherry blossoms. And after they had that smell, they shocked them with electrical stimulation. This created an emotional response and a stress response, essentially putting them in a fight or flight mechanism. They allowed those male rats to breed, and they exposed the offspring to the smell of cherry blossoms as well. And those offspring, not with the electrical shock, just from the smell of the cherry blossoms, they had the same stress response as their fathers. And to further that, the next generation also have the same stress response. So we know that our emotional responses, our way we interact with our world from a physical and emotional standpoint is going to influence generations to come. And influence is what we call our DNA methylation. This is essentially what runs our genes. So we need to define stress for our patients. We need to define toxins for our patients. We have what we call exotoxins from the outside world. Since World War II, we've had an implosion in the United States of over 87,000 more chemicals put into the environment. And these chemicals have not been tested for the most part, have not been tested for safety individually, let alone combined as a combined total load. And we're seeing studies come out now over the years. One of the first ones to come out was what we call the body burden study from Environmental Working Group, and looked at the number of toxins in the umbilical blood cord of the fetus. So we know that there's exotoxins, and we know that there's actually endotoxins coming from within our own bodies. And a lot of this is because of a poor gut microbiome. And we're off-gassing bad bugs that are harbored in our gut. And of course, that can create a toxic environment, an inflammatory gut lining, what we call gut permeability or gut dysbiosis. And those toxins then can escape the gut lining. And one of the biggest places they're going to go is the brain. Our thoughts. I'm gonna go over essentially how subluxations affect our DNA, our epigenetics. And I'm going to go over here shortly in regards to what I call the fear monger, the amygdala. Once we are experiencing any kind of stressor, it creates an emotional profile pattern on our brain, an imprint. And it can create our thought patterns, and these thoughts can be self-limiting. We also are going to inherit the thoughts of others, and especially our ancestors. And then there's technology. Technology we know is changing the way the brain is developing, and it's also influencing cognition in the older generation as well. So they're seeing basically thinning of the cortex and areas of the brain similar to that as Alzheimer's. So let's take a road here on the next slide. So the epigenetic effects of subluxation. What the heck am I talking about? We essentially have incoming traffic into the brain by our 5 FAR senses. This is information coming from the outside world into our brain. We have smell, sound, visual stimulation, visual input, taste, and touch. Those are 5 FAR senses. They come from the outside world in. All our sensations need to, let's see if I can get my arrow to work here, will come in and hit the sensory portion of the thalamus. But there's 3 nerve senses that come from within our body. And this is so profound to us as chiropractors. This is really where the rubber's going to hit the road. We have the vestibular system. That is our sense of balance. It sounds so simplistic. However, the vestibular system is the master regulator. It's a CEO. It's the air traffic controller of all 8 sensory systems. Allowing those 8 sensory systems to talk to each other, it's going to regulate the timing, the input, the impact, the volume of the sensory information coming into the brain. Then we have proprioception. Proprioception, we talk a lot about that in the chiropractic world, because when we do an adjustment, we're firing those mechanoreceptors and we're upregulating proprioception into the brain, into the CNS. Proprioception is calming. It is centering. It calms our nervous system down. It tells us who we are and where we are in space. as does the vestibular system. It tells us where we are in space. Proprioception will screen out other unwanted sensory input. So when we get too much overload and too much input into the brain, proprioception, provided it's working well, will calm down the system and allow us to navigate the system without getting what I call too crazy brain. So vestibular input is going to come from all spinal joints, very big, very pronounced in the upper cervical spine. And of course, the inner ear and the cerebellum is going to carry a lot of vestibular input. Proprioception, again, our entire spinal joints and our extremities. And then there's what we call the neurovisceral input or interoception. This is sensory input from our viscera and organs. This is all vagal tone. 80% of visceral input into the brain is via the vagus nerve, and the majority of that is parasympathetic in nature. So we have a barrage of sensory information coming from the outside in and from the bottom up into the thalamus. Now, the brilliant Heidi Havoc out there talks about the prefrontal cortex and how that frontal cortex can flip. So that's a top-down approach, and we're going to now cover it from a bottom-up and bottom-up, outside-in approach. When this input comes into the brain and it's too dysregulated, it's not making sense, essentially. It's distorted. It's a barrage of information. It doesn't hook up. It's like doing a dot-to-dot puzzle, and you can't connect the dots. So you can't create the full picture in your mind of what it is you're supposed to respond to. So there is a sensory motor loop. When sensory input comes in, we're to decipher it, connect it together. It's all about connectivity and talking to each other. This information is supposed to connect and make sense as how we respond with appropriate motor output. And when that loop happens well, we're in an adaptable state wherein we can get into a rest and digest state. We can be calm in our environment. We can feel secure. We can be comfortable. When that information comes in, then it comes in and hits the amygdala, which I call the fear monger. It creates an impression. The amygdala is our rate limiting factor in life. It will allow us to go forward if we're not stuck in a fear mode, or it can freeze us. And we can get into what we call a freeze response or a freeze and dissociate response. If an incident is so traumatic to us that the brain says, I don't want to remember this. This is, let's say, PTSD situation. PTSD is often because of a dysregulation of information coming into the brain, and it's so overwhelming, the brain doesn't want to remember that traumatic experience. So we don't integrate that emotional response, that memory, but it stays lingering out there, and it always keeps us on edge. So when we go and experience a similar situation, or even a perceived situation coming up, it doesn't even have to be a true situation, we are going to fire up into the sensory thalamus and what I call limbic lock and load mode. When we get stuck in that limbic system, we get stuck in a sympathetic dominant state. We crank that amygdala, it's firing, it's going to regulate our HPA axis. And from that, there's going to be a plethora of neurophysiological responses in a negative way, because you're going to have stress on the cardiovascular system, on the endocrine system. Your adrenal glands are cranking all the time. And from there, we get a host of neurophysiological responses and mental responses. If we're stuck in a cortisol burst all the time, it's going to appear, it's an anxiety state. These are the individuals that I hate this diagnosis. I refer to as GAD, general anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorders are taking over, especially in our teenage population group. And so often it's because they're stuck in this sensory loop and they're stuck in limbic lock and load mode. The amygdala is also going to regulate the ANS axis. So our gas versus brake pedal mode, we're going to be stuck in that gas pedal mode and our brake pedal can't shut down. When that happens, we cannot be in a rest and digest state. When that happens, we get a chronic cortisol kick. Cortisol initially is anti-inflammatory, but over time becomes pro-inflammatory, especially in the brain and in the gut. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So this loop that gets created becomes a memory. Let's say you have a tragic situation that happens or a death in the family. It creates this visceral response. You may even have a true heartache. Your heart actually hurts. That is a visceral emotional response that sets us into the same loop. Maybe it is you go through a divorce. The kiddos experience a divorce of the parents. This memory pattern it's going to follow the same loop. So that might trigger an individual not to want to get into relationships or bond with others because they're too afraid of that emotional pain again. So this is really the way we navigate life in general. This is the way, but every decision we make in life comes from a limbic, we make an emotional decision from that limbic system. And that's what drives us to make decisions. Now, when we get stuck in limbic lock and load mode, we have the frontal lobe, the executive functioning part of our brain. He shuts down, checks out. Essentially, the executive functioning part of the brain, our decision maker, our reasonable, our rational center, the way we make decisions, the way we can respond appropriately, he's out the lunch. He's not working anymore. So it's like trying to reason with somebody in the middle of a heated argument. It's not going to happen, right? These are the kiddos that we try to parent them, discipline them with the same techniques. And really, their reasonable logic capacity, their impulse control is gone. So I tell teachers, principals, etc., it's like, what's the definition of insanity? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's what we're doing with so many of these kiddos. We're telling them, no, don't do that, or that's not appropriate. That frontal lobe is checked out. It's gone. It's offline. They're living in this limbic lock and load mode. So going from a top-down approach and trying to get them cognitively to respond is not necessarily going to be our best approach. Two approaches together, working from bottom up and outside in, regulating that sensory input, along with behavioral cognitive therapies and those type of therapies, and meeting in the middle, connecting these parts of the brain, allowing these two parts of the brain to communicate. That's where it's at. And this is where chiropractic is so imperative, because guess what? What do we have the ability to do? We have the ability to free up subluxations and neuromechanical stressors on the spine, regulating the input into the brain, into the CNS, in regards to especially vestibular proprioception and neurovisceral or interoceptive input into the brain. When we can regulate that input into the brain, it's not so chaotic. It's not so overwhelming. It's more organized when it comes into the brain. And we can help to regulate that limbic system and that limbic drive, bringing that frontal lobe back online, allowing for the brain to be connected and calm. Now, if that doesn't happen, if we stay stuck in this limbic drive, we're not in a rest and digest state. And what are we talking about all over now? We're talking about the microbiome. If we're not in a rest and digest state, this picture graphic on the left shows what happens is the mucosal lining gets inflamed. It allows that barrier to become permeable. And now the bad juju, the endotoxins, because we're not in a rest and digest state, we're eating bad foods for the most part of the SAD diet, the standard American diet. The food sits in the gut, it putrefies, it off-gasses. The bad bacteria can escape the gut lining, and where does it meander? It heads up to the brain, creating a neuroinflammatory response. Two big guns in this whole ball game are gluten and casein, by the way, because each of those carry a opioid, a morphine peptide. Casein, morphine, gluteomorphine, those are extremely neuroinflammatory. They can escape the gut lining, hit the brain, and cause a neuroinflammatory response, along with a host of other bacterial viral loads. The key regulator of this is going to be the vagus nerve, by the way. The vagus nerve, I'm not sure if you can see the graphic, but the vagus nerve is going to modulate your inflammatory response. I tell patients it's the inflammatory shutoff valve. It shuts your inflammation off. It does that by the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. The vagus nerve also modulates our gastrointestinal function. I call it the big bad voodoo daddy. So if we have poor sensory input via visceral afferents, vagal visceral afferents into the brain, we can't modulate that inflammatory response. What else do I want to tell you? I'm on very little sleep right now, by the way. I had quite the trip coming here to Vegas. So vagus nerve tones down. By the way, a lot of you out there may use agents, probiotics. Our research also suggests that very key probiotics that will modulate the limbic lobe, the hypothalamus, and the frontal lobe. There's a couple key probiotics we know of. One is Lactobacillus rhamnosus, and one is Lactobacillus reuteri. They have an effect on mood, anxiety, and depression. However, they will not have that same effect on the brain if vagal tone is deficient. So from a whole perspective, if we take the whole ball of wax and look at the big picture, if we have chronic subluxation patterns, abnormal afferent input to the CNS, which we have those studies with Heidi Havoc out of New Zealand showing that the adjustments do affect processing of the prefrontal cortex. If we have that abnormal afferent information into the brain, our sensory systems, all 8 sensory systems are dysregulated. We get stuck in a limbic drive. We get stuck in a fight or flight situation. The HPA axis shuts down. It shuts down our gut. And that's essentially what we're seeing across all ages and all stages. So this information actually is pertinent from developing minds to diseased minds all across the board. When the other very cool information that we have is that a mom's emotional response pattern, if she's in this limbic drive during pregnancy, it's going to drive that same response with the offspring, with the little fiddle farts. So what can happen is there's very key developmental windows of opportunity, what I call them. There's sensitive periods of time for neurodevelopment that a child should go through various motor milestones. And then there's hardcore cutoff periods of time that a child should go through different developmental milestones. And these developmental milestones are very much associated, especially with development of the frontal cortex and the visual processing system. If the visual processing system, that's one of the biggest sensory systems we see associated with neuropsychiatric disorders. That's a lot where the research is lying. We have the most research on. If we do not master these developmental milestones, these developmental windows of time can close, and specific areas of the brain are offline, so to speak. And those specific areas are what later on in their deficiency can lead to a neuropsychiatric disorder, especially in male teens, and with diagnoses like schizophrenia, etc. So if we have an infant that is subluxated, cannot get into these movement patterns and go through these developmental milestones, our primitive reflexes can be set and stay too active. We have a hard time getting those integrated. Our posture reflexes, higher, more sophisticated parts of the brain, our sensory motor systems will be weakened, and therefore we can't build up to cognition and develop that prefrontal cortex. So again, assessing children right from the get-go, allowing them to get into these movement patterns. If they're subluxation free, they'll have proper sensory input, be able to reach those motor milestones, be able to move through these processes, integrate those primitive reflexes, and build those higher, more sophisticated parts of the central nervous system. So hopefully that gives you some words of wisdom to chew on, and really hits home the huge effects we have on epigenetic regulation, our long-term physical and mental health. If you see a study called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, it talks about trauma in the early years of life, and they're showing that this trauma sets into action exactly this pattern. And those children are said to have about a 20-year less life expectancy because of the neurophysiological consequences, especially in the cardiovascular system. Okay, Alan, I think I finished my my little tidbit here. Hopefully, hopefully you enjoyed that. Please sign in first Thursday in March for the amazing Tony Evil. He'll drop some more knowledge bombs. Next week, Nicole Lindsay, another beautiful soul, is going to do her show for chiropractic and women in chiropractic. And I'll be back next month with hopefully more sleep under my belt and more amazing information to bring your way. Again, thank you, ChiroSecure, and thank you for all the docs out there working so hard to change lives and change the future.
Today's pediatric show, Look to the Children, was brought to you by ChiroSecure and the award-winning book series, I Am a Lovable Me. Make sure you join us next week, right here at the same time. See you next week.